With a market valuation of more than $40 billion and well over 500,000 employees worldwide, FedEx has millions of shipments delivered daily in nations all over the world for millions of dollars. However, in the 1970s, this giant of a company was literally being gambled by its founder over a game of blackjack. Frederich Wallace Smith, the founder of FedEx, did not get off to a good start in life. From being diagnosed with a form of childhood arthritis, to being bullied for his inability to walk, to being drafted into the Vietnam War, his rough childhood made him into a man with a mindset of a warrior. Here begins the story of the man that made impossible possible. Fred established his first little business, the Ardent Record Company, while still in high school, which he and a few buddies founded. Small recording studio in a garage was where it all began, but later expanded into a larger recording enterprise that is still in business today right now. Fred, however, departed the business in 1962 to enroll in Yale University's economics program. Fred offered a company concept in a term paper he completed in his junior year. Packages at the time were delivered across the U.S. by being transported in the cargo holds of commercial aircraft. The passenger airlines controlled the scheduling. This resulted in parcel delivery delays. However, his professor rejected the idea and gave him a C grade. Later, while serving in the military, Fred saw a lot of interesting things, especially the military's ability to handle the supply chains of cargo and other supplies. He thought it could be made a lot faster and smoother. Fred also developed a habit of playing the card game, blackjack. What he could never imagine that one day, this card game would save his business and life. After coming back from the Vietnam War, Fred began working on his dream. At first, he started working on his father-in-law's business of aviation sales. Then, he began raising money to acquire a few aircrafts so he could operate the business. Investors were heavily impressed with Fred's knowledge of the airline system. So by 1972, Fred managed to get around $91 million in loans and venture capital funding to build his revolutionary shipping business. Now, Fred's initial plan was actually to focus on checks to start with. Of course, nowadays we take for granted money being instantly transferred all over the world. But back in the days when people sent checks as payments, it was often a very long process. And so Fred contacted the Federal Reserve, America's central banking system, hoping they could strike up a partnership. At the time, checks would often have a 10-day turnaround time, whereas with Fred's new shipping system, it could be a 24-hour process, allowing them to quickly deliver checks between the Federal Reserve banks. The Fed seemed to like the idea as well and agreed to the deal, so Fred went ahead and bought and outfitted a small fleet of lightweight aircraft to fulfill the contract. Landing the Fed as a client also inspired Fred's choice of business name, as he originally called the company, Federal Express. Thus, Fred's shipping business was finally born, and the Federal Express logo was proudly plastered on each plane, letterhead, business card, and bulletin board. Fred had his first client, and a very big client at that, and so the future looked exciting. And then, quite suddenly, the Federal Reserve backed out of the deal, meaning Fred was stuck with the planes, bills, and the name Federal Express, despite no longer working with the Fed. This was a massive setback, but Fred kept the name Federal Express anyway. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1994 that he changed the company name to FedEx Corporation instead, because most people simply referred to the company by the shortened nickname FedEx anyway. But anyway, back in the early 70s, since he was no longer going to be transporting checks for the Federal Reserve, Fred turned his attention to shipping small urgent packages for businesses and consumers. And on April 17, 1973, FedEx officially began operating. Fred chose to base the company in Memphis since it was fairly centrally located in the U.S., which made it an ideal hub for Fred's plan. Plus, Memphis Airport agreed to make certain adjustments they needed for the business to operate smoothly and had additional hangar space readily available. Plus, the airport was rarely closed because of bad weather. So FedEx was in business, And on the first night of operating, 14 aircraft delivered 186 packages to 25 different U.S. cities, and word of this overnight delivery system quickly spread. The vision Fred had back when he wrote that economics paper all those years ago was finally now a reality. But little did Fred know, a crisis was about to begin that would completely destroy the business. Just as Fred's business was beginning, so was the 1973 oil crisis. You see, because of political tensions in the Middle East, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, placed an oil embargo on countries they believed were supporting Israel, which included the United States, where Fred was operating his business. Since the U.S. heavily relied on oil from the Middle East, they were one of the hardest hit countries, and the oil prices quadrupled. And these rapidly rising fuel costs put FedEx in serious trouble. Federal Express was just getting off the ground, and the 14 Falcon airplanes took a lot of jet fuel. And because of the oil embargo, jet fuel was hitting historic high prices with no potential downturn in sight. As a result, FedEx's operating costs were spiraling out of control, and the company was losing an estimated $30,000 per day. Fred's vision was literally running out of gas, and Federal Express's hopeful beginnings were losing altitude. It's estimated in the first 26 months of business, Fred Smith saw a $29 million loss. And understandably, investors were not so keen on putting more money in, since it was unclear when oil prices would drop again. Fred became so desperate that he had to ask his loyal employees to hold on to their paychecks and not cash them for as long as possible in order to try and keep the company afloat. FedEx pilots and drivers even started using their own credit cards to fuel up and get reimbursed later, as they knew how little money the company had left. Fred himself completely stopped taking any pay from the company because there wasn't really any to take. But it still wasn't enough. The oil embargo and difficult economic situation was all too much. The company got down to its last $5,000 in its bank account, and at that moment, Fred received a fuel bill for $24,000. It was a Friday, and with $5,000 in the business bank account and a bill of $24,000 due by Monday, it seemed Federal Express was heading for bankruptcy. In a desperate last-ditch attempt to save the business, Fred Smith tried to land a potential investment deal with General Dynamics, which could secure an emergency cash influx. He put his best suit on and went into the meeting believing this could be the turning point for his company. But the deal fell through. Due to the volatility of the current situation and the need to be conservative, General Dynamics rejected his pitch. After this denial for further business financing, it seemed Fred could not afford to pay the fuel bill, and therefore this was the end of his business. Fred was due to start boarding his flight in a few minutes, but at the last moment, he decided he wasn't going back to Memphis. Instead, Fred withdrew the final $5,000 in his company's bank account and impulsively booked a new flight instead to a different destination. Fred Smith was heading to Las Vegas. Fred had decided, if we're going to go down, we're going to go down with a fight. That's why he'd taken the company's last $5,000 and decided he was going to gamble it and try to win enough money to pay FedEx's bills. So, the survival of FedEx came down to a weekend of gambling in Las Vegas. Once Fred landed in Vegas, he headed straight to the blackjack tables. Now, blackjack is a pretty simple game. Your cards need to add up to a higher number than the dealer, but not go over 21. However, in the 70s, there were some blackjack tables which just used one deck of cards, which meant it was easier to count cards and gain an edge, a skill Fred had developed in the Marines from all the time he spent playing the game. Of course, whilst this gave him a slight advantage, it was still a game reliant on luck, and Fred's luck definitely went both up and down. He'd win a couple of hands, but then lose a couple, and so his winnings went up and down as well. At one point managed to get up to $35,000. He felt unstoppable. But then he had a bad hand, and then another. His confidence started to shake. his earnings were quickly falling. Luckily, he stopped with just enough. By the end of the weekend, Fred had successfully turned Federal Express' remaining balance of $5,000 into $27,000. And that was enough to pay the looming fuel bill and keep the company in the air for another week. So Fred quit. Now, obviously, $27,000 wasn't going to save the company long term, but it bought himself and the company a little more time to come up with a plan. Over time, Fred got millions of dollars of investment from investors and created one of the largest companies in the world. Hit the like and subscribe button if you found this story inspiring. Also press the bell notifications to not miss such videos.